There are moments when the past refuses to stay buried, when secrets, carefully guarded for generations, suddenly resurface, not through confession, not through documents, but through something as simple as a photograph, a single image that someone desperately wanted to disappear forever. In 1952, a woman named Margaret Howell discovered such a photograph in her childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina. It had been hidden behind a false panel in the wall of what was once her grandmother's bedroom. The photo itself wasn't shocking at first glance. It showed 7 people standing in front of a church, taken sometime in the 1870s. But what Margaret found written on the back of that photograph, in her grandmother's own handwriting, would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. And what made it truly haunting was this. Her grandmother had written 3 words that made no sense at all. 3 words that would lead Margaret down a path of discovery so disturbing she would spend the next 3 years trying to understand what her grandmother had been hiding. And when she finally pieced it together, she made the same decision her grandmother had made 80 years earlier. She hid the photograph again. But this time, she left behind a letter explaining why. What Margaret uncovered wasn't just a family secret. It was a carefully orchestrated erasure of truth, a conspiracy of silence that had cost lives, and a moral dilemma that would haunt her until her final days. Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1952, was a city caught between 2 worlds. The old guard still clung to antebellum memories, holding garden parties in crumbling mansions and speaking in hushed tones about the way things used to be. Meanwhile, a new generation was pushing forward, renovating historic homes, modernizing businesses, and carefully, very carefully, beginning to question the stories they'd been told about the past. Margaret Howell belonged to this second group. At 41 years old, she was a school teacher, a widow, and a practical woman who believed in progress. She had inherited the narrow townhouse on King Street from her father, who had inherited it from his mother, Constance Howell. And in the spring of 1952, Margaret decided it was time to make that house her own. The townhouse was typical of Charleston's historic district, 3 stories tall, painted a faded yellow, with black shutters and a small wrought iron balcony on the second floor. Inside, the rooms were dark and cramped, the wallpaper was peeling, and the wood floors creaked with every step. Margaret's grandmother, Constance, had lived there alone from 1905 until her death in 1948, and in all those years, she had changed almost nothing. The furniture was Victorian, heavy and oppressive. The curtains were thick velvet that blocked out the sunlight. Every surface was crowded with porcelain figurines, framed daguerreotypes, and leather-bound books that no one ever read. Walking through that house felt like stepping into a museum or a mausoleum. Margaret had kept the house largely untouched for 4 years after her grandmother's death, partly out of respect, and partly because she had been too busy grieving her husband, who had died in the war. But by 1952, she was ready for a change. She hired a local contractor, a man named Robert Fletcher, and told him she wanted to renovate the second floor, starting with what had been Constance's bedroom. The bedroom was at the back of the house, overlooking a narrow courtyard filled with overgrown camellias and jasmine. It was a modest room, about 12 feet by 14 feet, with a high ceiling and a single window. The walls were covered in dark green wallpaper that had faded to a sickly olive color, and the wood paneling along the lower half of the walls was warped and water-stained. Margaret wanted it all torn out. She wanted light, air, and something that felt like the 20th century. Robert and his assistant, a young man named Danny, started work on a Monday morning in early April. Margaret was at school, teaching her 5th grade class, when Robert called her during lunch break. His voice sounded strange, cautious, almost uncomfortable. "Mrs. Howell, I think you need to come home," he said. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked, already gathering her things. "Not wrong, exactly, but we found something, behind the wall in your grandmother's room. I think you should see it." Margaret drove home as quickly as she could, her mind racing with possibilities. Had they found damage? Rot? evidence of termites. When she arrived, Robert was waiting for her in the front hallway, holding a leather pouch in his hands. It was small, about the size of a book, and so old that the leather had dried and cracked like autumn leaves. It was behind the paneling, Robert explained as he led her upstairs. We were prying off the boards when Danny noticed a gap in the wall, a space that had been sealed up with plaster. We opened it up and found this inside. He showed her the wall. The paneling had been removed, revealing the old horsehair plaster beneath. And there, at about shoulder height, was a rectangular cavity about 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep. Someone had carefully carved out the space between 2 wall studs, placed the leather pouch inside, and then sealed it shut with fresh plaster. Over the years, the plaster had aged and blended with the surrounding wall, making it invisible. If Robert hadn't been removing the paneling, no one would ever have known it was there. Margaret took the pouch from him. It was heavier than she expected, and she could feel something solid inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the brass clasp, so tarnished it was almost black, and looked inside. There was a photograph mounted on thick cardboard, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper. She pulled out the photograph first. It was a formal portrait, professionally taken, showing 7 people standing in a row in front of a simple wooden building. The photograph was sepia-toned, faded with age, but still clear enough to make out the faces. All 7 people were black, 4 men and 3 women, dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore dark coats, some of them ill-fitting, and the women wore plain dresses with high collars. They stood very straight, very still, their faces solemn in the way that people looked in old photographs when exposure times were long, and any movement would blur the image. But there was something else in their faces. Something Margaret couldn't quite name, a kind of intensity, a watchfulness. They looked like people who had something important to say. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, embossed in gold lettering, were the words, Thomas J. Waring, Portraits and Daguerreotypes, 127 Meeting Street, Charleston, SC, 1872. And below that, in handwriting Margaret recognized immediately as her grandmother's, were 3 words written in fading black ink. They know what happened. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She stood there in her grandmother's empty bedroom, holding a photograph that had been hidden in a wall for at least 50 years, possibly longer, staring at 7 faces and 3 words that made absolutely no sense. Mrs. Howell. Robert's voice broke through her thoughts. Do you know who those people are? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, I've never seen this photograph before. I don't know who they are. She unfolded the piece of paper that had been in the pouch with the photograph. It was a receipt, written in elegant cursive script on letterhead from Thomas J. Waring's photography studio. The receipt was dated April 23rd, 1872, and it read, Received from Reverend S. Tilden, the sum of $3,000 for 1 photographic portrait, 7 subjects, with mounting, paid in full. Thomas J. Waring. Margaret read it twice, then looked back at the photograph. Reverend S. Tilden. She didn't recognize the name, but someone, her grandmother presumably, had thought this photograph was important enough to hide. Important enough to seal behind a wall where no one would ever find it. Robert cleared his throat. Should we keep working, Mrs. Howell? Or would you like us to stop for the day? Keep working, Margaret said absently, still staring at the photograph. I'll be downstairs if you need me. She went down to the parlor, sat in one of the old Victorian chairs, and studied the photograph for a long time. She looked at each face, trying to memorize them. The man on the far left was tall and thin, with graying hair and deeply lined face. Next to him was a woman about the same age, with a round face and eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at Margaret, across 80 years. Then, a younger man, broad-shouldered, with his hands clasped in front of him. Another woman, small and slight, standing very straight. An older man with a white beard. A younger woman, barely more than a girl, with her hair pulled back severely. And finally, another man, middle-aged, with an expression that Margaret could only describe as haunted. 7 people, 7 strangers, and her grandmother had written, "They know what happened." Know what? What had happened, and why would Constance hide this photograph? Margaret turned her attention to the folded paper beneath the photograph, the piece she'd noticed but hadn't yet examined. She pulled it out carefully. It was a letter, written on the same yellowed paper as the receipt, but in different handwriting. The ink was faded but still legible. The letter was dated May 15th, 1872, and it began, "My dear Constance, I write to you in the strictest confidence, knowing that your discretion can be trusted absolutely. You have asked me what became of the inquiry, and I have delayed answering in the hope that time would soften the bitter truth. But you deserve to know, and so I will tell you plainly. The inquiry has been closed. No charges will be brought. The sheriff has declared that there is no evidence to support the allegations made by the 7 individuals who came forward. The matter is finished. I know this news will pain you, as it has pained me. We both know what your father confessed to you before his passing. We both know that those allegations were not false. But knowing the truth and proving the truth are 2 different things, particularly when the truth concerns events that occurred during the chaos of war, on property that no longer exists in its original form and involves people whose testimony is not given the weight it deserves. The 7 individuals who brought this matter forward showed great courage. They risked much to speak, but they have learned, as I feared they would, that courage is not always rewarded. I have counseled them to let this matter rest, for their own safety. Some have already left the area. Those who remain are fearful. I cannot, in good conscience, advise you to speak of this publicly. Too many people would be harmed, yourself included. Your family's name would be destroyed. And to what end? Your father is gone. The property is sold. The war is over. We must look to the future, not the past. But I understand why you wish to preserve some record. The photograph I arranged to be taken, the one you now possess, may serve that purpose. It is proof that these 7 people existed, that they came forward, that they tried. Perhaps someday, when the wounds of war have healed and the world is more just, someone will look at that photograph and understand what they attempted to do. Until then, I urge you to keep it safe, keep it private, and pray, as I do, that God grants peace to those who have suffered. Your faithful friend, Eleanor Margaret, read the letter 3 times. Her mind was racing. Her grandmother had hidden this photograph deliberately. And whoever Eleanor was, a friend, clearly, someone Constance had trusted, she had known about something terrible. Something involving Margaret's great-grandfather, who had died in 1871. Something involving 7 people who had come forward to make allegations. Allegations that were closed, dismissed, buried. They know what happened. Margaret's hands were shaking now. She set the photograph and letter on the side table and walked to the window, trying to steady herself. Outside, King Street was busy with afternoon traffic, cars and pedestrians, the normal rhythms of modern life. But inside this house, inside this photograph, was something from another world, a secret that her grandmother had kept for her entire life. Margaret knew in that moment that she was going to have to find out what it was. Margaret's first instinct was to call her mother. Sarah Howell, Margaret's mother-in-law, was 83 years old and still sharp as a tack. She had been married to Margaret's father, Richard Howell, Constance's only son, and she had lived in the King Street house herself from 1895 until 1920. If anyone knew about Constance's secrets, it would be Sarah. But when Margaret called and described the photograph and the letter, Sarah's response was disappointing. "I never heard anything about a photograph," Sarah said over the phone, her voice crackling with static. "Your grandmother was a very private woman, Margaret. She didn't share family business even with me. And I can tell you honestly, I never heard her mention anything about an inquiry or any allegations. If something happened before the war, or even right after it, Constance never spoke of it." "What about Eleanor?" Margaret asked. "Do you know who that might be?" There was a long pause. Then Sarah said, "There was an Eleanor something or other that Constance used to mention. An old friend from when she was young, but I don't think I ever met her. She might have died before I married into the family. I'm sorry, dear. I wish I could help more." Margaret thanked her and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the photograph, the letter, and the receipt, and tried to think logically. She was a teacher. She believed in research, evidence, and systematic inquiry. If she wanted to understand what this photograph meant, she needed to start with what she knew and work outward. What did she know? 7 people had come forward with allegations in 1872. The allegations involved Margaret's great-grandfather, Charles Howell. An inquiry had been opened and then closed. A minister named Reverend S. Tilden had paid for a photograph of the 7 people, and Constance, Margaret's grandmother, had hidden that photograph in a wall, along with a letter from someone named Eleanor. Margaret decided to start with the photographer, Thomas J. Waring. If his studio had been on Meeting Street in 1872, there might be records. Charleston had a historical society, and they kept archives of old businesses. The next day, after school, Margaret drove to the Charleston Historical Society building on Church Street. The building was a grand old mansion that had been converted into offices and archive rooms. Margaret spoke to the librarian, a woman named Dorothy Simmons, who wore thick glasses and had a reputation for knowing everything about Charleston's history. When Margaret explained what she was looking for, Dorothy's eyes lit up. Thomas Waring. Oh yes, he was one of the most prolific photographers in Charleston during the Reconstruction era. His records are quite complete, actually. We have several ledgers from his studio. What year are you interested in? 1872, Margaret said. April, specifically. Dorothy disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later, carrying a large leather-bound ledger. She set it on the table in front of Margaret and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and fragile, covered in neat handwriting that recorded every photograph Waring had taken. The date, the subject, the price, and sometimes a brief note. Margaret flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. There were dozens of them, portraits of prominent Charleston families, wedding photographs, memorial photographs of deceased children, a common practice at the time. And then on the page dated April 23rd, 1872, she found it. Reverend Samuel Tilden. Group portrait, 7 subjects, outdoor setting. Mount Pleasant Church. 3 doors, paid in full. There it was. Reverend Samuel Tilden. Not S. Tilden, but Samuel. And the location, Mount Pleasant Church. Margaret copied the information into her notebook, her heart racing. "Do you know anything about Mount Pleasant Church?" she asked Dorothy. Dorothy frowned thoughtfully. "There are several churches with similar names in the area. But if this was in 1872, and if it involved a reverend who was commissioning a photograph of 7 people, I'd guess it was a freedmen's church." After the war, there were quite a few small churches established by and for the black community. Many of them were rural, outside Charleston proper. Some of them don't exist anymore. How would I find out more about Reverend Tilden? "Church records," Dorothy said. "Some of them are here in our archives. Others are held by the churches themselves if they still exist. But I have to warn you, records from that period, especially from black churches, are often incomplete. Many were lost or destroyed." Margaret thanked her and spent the next 3 hours going through the archives. She found references to several churches in the area, with variations of Mount Pleasant in their names, but none that clearly matched. She found lists of ministers who had served in the Charleston area during the 1870s, but no Samuel Tilden. She was about to give up for the day when Dorothy returned with another ledger. "I thought of something," Dorothy said. "We have records from the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency that was set up after the war to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. They kept detailed records of schools, churches, and community organizations. Let me see if there's anything about a Reverend Tilden." She opened the ledger and began flipping through the pages. These records were different. Handwritten reports, letters, census-style lists of names and occupations. And then, halfway through, Dorothy stopped. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry dated March 1870. "Reverend Samuel Tilden, minister, Mount Pleasant African Methodist Episcopal Church, located approximately 18 miles west of Charleston, near the former Fairmont plantation. Congregation size, approximately 40 families." Margaret's breath caught. Fairmont, that was the name of her family's old estate, the plantation that had been sold after the war. "Fairmont was your family's property, wasn't it?" Dorothy asked carefully. "Yes," Margaret said. "It was sold in 1869. I've never been there. I don't even know if anything's left." Dorothy gave her a long look. "Margaret, I don't mean to pry, but if you're digging into something that involves your family's plantation and a group of 7 people in 1872, you should know that Reconstruction was a difficult time. A lot of things happened that people didn't talk about afterward. A lot of wounds that never healed." Margaret met her eyes. "I need to know what happened. Whatever it is, I need to know." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Then I'd suggest you look into the county sheriff's records from that period. If there was an inquiry, there would be a record of it. They're kept at the courthouse." The Charleston County Courthouse was an imposing building on Broad Street, with tall white columns and marble steps. Margaret had walked past it 1,000 times, but had never been inside. She went the next afternoon, after school, and asked to see the records from 1872. The clerk, an older man with a bored expression, led her to a musty basement room filled with rows of metal shelves. The shelves were packed with boxes, each labeled with a year and a category. Criminal cases, civil cases, property disputes, inquiries. Margaret found the box labeled Inquiries, 1872, and carried it to a small table in the corner. Inside were dozens of files, each one a thin folder containing a few pages of handwritten notes. She went through them one by one, reading about minor disputes, allegations of theft, questions about property boundaries. And then, near the bottom of the box, she found a file labeled Inquiry Re. Fairmont Estate, April 1872. The file was thinner than she expected, only 3 pages. The first page was a formal record of the inquiry, written in the careful hand of someone who had been trained in legal documentation, County of Charleston, South Carolina. Record of inquiry date, opened, April 10th, 1872. Matter: allegations brought by 7 individuals, names listed below, regarding treatment of workers at Fairmont Estate during period of 1863-1865. Individuals bringing allegations: Benjamin Cook, age 34, laborer Mary Cook, age 31, domestic worker Elias Grant, age 42, laborer Susanna Gray, age 28, domestic worker Thomas Perry, age 50, laborer Rachel Perry, age 22, domestic worker Samuel Porter, age 38, laborer allegations. The above-named individuals claim to have knowledge of unlawful confinement and resulting deaths of 3 individuals on the property of Fairmont Estate in or around January-February 1865. Margaret's hands were shaking as she read. Unlawful confinement. Deaths. January-February 1865. That was the final winter of the war, when everything had been falling apart. When Sherman's army had been cutting through the South and panic had been everywhere. She forced herself to keep reading. Nature of allegations. The individuals claim that 3 workers at Fairmont Estate, identified as Marcus, a man of approximately 30 years, Joseph, a man of approximately 25 years, and Dinah, a woman of approximately 35 years, were confined in an underground cellar on the property as punishment for attempted desertion. According to the allegations, the property owner, Charles Howell, subsequently abandoned the property for a period of several weeks in January 1865 due to the approach of Union forces. The allegations state that Mr. Howell did not release the 3 confined individuals before departing. and that when he returned in February 1865, he found them deceased. The allegations further state that Mr. Howell disposed of the remains and destroyed evidence of the confinement. Margaret had to stop reading. She put the file down and pressed her hands to her face. 3 people, locked in a cellar, forgotten, left to die. She took several deep breaths, then forced herself to continue reading. Investigation conducted. Sheriff James Rutherford visited the former site of Fairmont Estate on April 15, 1872. Property has changed ownership since the events in question and has been significantly altered. Main house remains, but outbuildings have been removed or collapsed. No evidence of underground cellar found. Current property owner, Mr. Henry Davidson, states that when he purchased the property in 1869, several structures, including a barn and storage buildings, were in advanced state of disrepair. Mr. Davidson states that he had these structures dismantled and the materials burned or buried. Testimony of property owner's family, Mrs. Louisa Howell, widow of Charles Howell, deceased 1871, and Miss Constance Howell, daughter, were interviewed on April 18, 1872. Both stated that they had no knowledge of any unlawful confinement or deaths on the property. Both stated that Charles Howell had been a man of good character who treated his workers fairly within the customs of the time. Both expressed the belief that the allegations are false and motivated by malice. Margaret felt sick. Her great-grandmother and her grandmother, Constance herself, had denied everything. They had protected Charles Howell's reputation. They had called the 7 people liars. She read the final paragraph. Conclusion. Due to the lack of physical evidence, the passage of 7 years since the alleged events, the death of the accused party, Charles Howell, and the conflicting testimony, this inquiry is closed without findings. No charges to be brought. Matter concluded May 3, 1872. Sheriff James Rutherford. Margaret sat in the basement of the courthouse for a long time, staring at those 3 pages. 7 people had come forward with a horrific story. They had risked everything to tell the truth, and the inquiry had been dismissed. No evidence. Matter concluded. But why? If there was no evidence, why had Constance hidden the photograph? Why had she kept the letter from Eleanor? Why had she written, "They know what happened" on the back of the picture? Because it was true, Margaret realized. Because Charles Howell had confessed to his daughter before he died. Because Constance had known those 7 people were telling the truth, and she had lied anyway. Margaret carefully returned the file to its box and left the courthouse. She walked along Broad Street in the warm afternoon sun, feeling as though she'd stepped out of a nightmare into normal life. People were shopping, chatting, going about their days. No one knew what she'd just read. No one knew that 80 years ago, 7 people had tried to get justice and failed. She got into her car and drove out of Charleston, heading west on the old Ashley River Road. She didn't have a specific destination in mind. She just needed to drive, to think, to process what she'd learned. And as she drove, she realized where she was going. She was going to find Fairmont. Margaret had never been to the site of the old Fairmont plantation. Her father had rarely spoken about it, and when he did, it was always with a kind of wistful sadness. The sadness of lost gentility, lost wealth, lost way of life. Margaret had never thought to question that narrative. But now, driving along the narrow country roads west of Charleston, she saw things differently. Fairmont wasn't just a lost estate. It was a place where people had been enslaved, a place where, according to 7 witnesses, 3 people had died horribly, a place where her great-grandfather had committed a terrible crime and then covered it up. She stopped at a small country store about 20 miles outside Charleston and asked the elderly man behind the counter if he knew where the old Fairmont property was. "Fairmont?" he said, scratching his chin. "That name sounds familiar. I think there used to be a place called that out on Hammond Road, but it's been broken up for years. There's a few different farms out there now." He gave her rough directions, and Margaret continued driving. The landscape became more rural, pine forests, fields of soybeans, small farmhouses set back from the road. She passed a weathered sign that said Hammond Road and turned down a narrow dirt lane. After about a mile, she saw an old farmhouse and beyond it, a man working in a field. She pulled over and walked across the field toward him. The man looked up as she approached. He was in his 60s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm sorry to bother you," Margaret said. "I'm looking for information about a property that used to be here. It was called Fairmont. It was a plantation before the war." The man's expression changed slightly, not unfriendly but guarded. "Fairmont. Yes, I know the name. Part of this land used to be Fairmont. Why are you asking?" Margaret hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My family used to own it. My great-grandfather was Charles Howell. I'm trying to learn about what happened here." The man studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "My name is Henry Davidson," he said. "My grandfather bought this property in 1869. Most of the old buildings were falling apart by then. He tore them down and built the house you see back there." Margaret felt a chill. Davidson. That was the name mentioned in the inquiry report. This man's grandfather had been the one who dismantled the outbuildings, who said there was no evidence of a cellar. "Do you know anything about what was here before?" she asked. "Any of the old structures?" Henry Davidson looked uncomfortable. "There was an old main house. My grandfather kept that for a while, but it burned down in the 20s. There was a barn, some sheds, a few slave cabins. All of them were in bad shape. My grandfather said the barn collapsed during a storm in 1870, so he just cleared the whole thing away. Was there ever—" Margaret paused, unsure how to phrase it. "Did your grandfather ever mention finding anything unusual when he was clearing the land?" Davidson's expression became even more guarded. "Why would you ask that?" "I found some documents," Margaret said carefully. "There was an inquiry in 1872. Some people came forward with allegations about what happened here during the war. I'm trying to understand if those allegations were true." Davidson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss, my grandfather bought this land fair and square. He worked it honestly. Whatever happened here before he owned it, that wasn't his fault. And I'll tell you something. He never talked about finding anything unusual. If there were things he cleared away, that was just part of making the land usable again." But the way he said it made Margaret think he was leaving something out. "Mr. Davidson," she said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not accusing your family of anything. I'm just trying to understand what happened. If you know anything at all, I would be grateful if you'd tell me." Davidson sighed. He took off his work gloves and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "All right," he said, "but this doesn't leave my property, understood? I don't want my family's name dragged into something that happened 80 years ago." "I understand," Margaret said. "My father told me a story once," Davidson said. "He was just a boy when it happened, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but he remembered it. This would have been around 1872, not long after my grandfather bought the place. There were some people from Charleston who came out here asking questions. My grandfather talked to them. I don't know what he told them, but afterward he was in a strange mood. My father said my grandfather went out to where the old barn had been and spent hours digging through the rubble. He never said what he was looking for, but that night my father saw him burning something in a fire pit behind the house. Burning something that looked like old wood planks and some kind of fabric or clothing. My father asked what it was, and my grandfather told him to mind his own business and never speak of it again." Margaret felt her heart pounding. "Do you think your grandfather found evidence of what happened?" "I don't know," Davidson said, "but I know he never talked about it, and I know he made a donation to the sheriff's office that year. A sizable one, according to my father. He said it was for community improvements, but my father always wondered if it was something else. A donation, just like the letter from Eleanor had mentioned. a generous contribution to the sheriff's discretionary fund. "Mr. Davidson," Margaret said, "do you know what happened to the people who came forward with those allegations? The 7 people?" He shook his head. "No, but I know there was talk back then. My father heard things from other people in the community. He said some of those folks died not long after. Some left the area, and folks said it wasn't a coincidence." Margaret thanked him and walked back to her car on shaking legs. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes, trying to process what she'd just learned. Henry Davidson's grandfather had found something. He had destroyed it and paid the sheriff to look the other way. And then the 7 witnesses had started dying. She needed to know more about those 7 people. She needed to know what had happened to them. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks immersed in research. She went to the Charleston Library, the Historical Society, and the County Records Office. She looked through census records, death certificates, property deeds, and old newspapers. Slowly, painfully, she began to piece together the lives of the 7 people in the photograph. Benjamin Cook had been born into slavery on the Fairmont plantation around 1838. After emancipation, he had stayed in the area, working as a sharecropper on land about 5 miles from the old estate. He had married Mary, who had also been enslaved at Fairmont, and they had 2 children. Margaret found Benjamin's death certificate dated June 18, 1872, cause of death, drowning. The brief description stated that he had been found in a creek near his home. The death was ruled accidental. Margaret found Mary Cook's death certificate 2 months later, August 9, 1872. Cause of death, fever, no other details. Elias Grant had been a field worker at Fairmont. After the war, he had worked on various farms in the area, never staying in one place for long. His death certificate was dated October 12, 1872. Cause of death, injury sustained from farm equipment. The notes indicated that he had been caught in a cotton gin and had died from his injuries several hours later. 3 deaths, all within 6 months of the photograph being taken, all ruled accidental or natural causes. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Susanna Gray's trail went cold. Margaret found her listed in the 1870 census, working as a domestic servant in Charleston. But after 1872, there was no record of her. She simply vanished from the public record. No death certificate, no marriage record, no tax documents. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Thomas Perry had lived longer than the others. He died in 1873, but his death certificate noted that he had suffered from a prolonged illness. Rachel Perry, his daughter, also disappeared from the records after 1872, just like Susanna Gray. And then there was Samuel Porter. Margaret found his name in multiple documents spanning nearly a decade after the photograph. He had worked as a laborer in Charleston, living in various rooming houses. But there was something strange about the records. Starting in 1873, several documents referred to him as the mute laborer Samuel Porter. Margaret found a reference to him in the patient register of the Charleston Almshouse, where he had spent his final years before dying in 1881. Next to his name, someone had written, "Deaf and mute, unable to communicate." Margaret stared at that notation for a long time. Samuel Porter had come forward in April 1872 to testify. By 1873, he was mute. She couldn't prove that something had been done to him, but the implication was chilling. 7 people had tried to speak the truth. Within a year, 3 were dead. 2 had disappeared, 1 was dying, and 1 had lost the ability to speak. Margaret knew she needed to find descendants. If anyone could confirm what had happened, it would be the families of these 7 people. She started with the Cooks, since they were the most well-documented. It took her 3 days of searching through birth and marriage records, but she finally found a lead. A man named Robert Cook, listed in the 1950 census as living in North Charleston. His age was recorded as 74, and his birthplace was Charleston County. Margaret calculated backward. He would have been born around 1876, just a few years after Benjamin and Mary Cook's deaths. Could he be their grandson? She found his address and drove to North Charleston. It was a modest neighborhood of small houses, many of them in need of repair. Margaret found the address and knocked on the door, her heart pounding. An elderly black man answered. He had grey hair and tired eyes, and he looked at Margaret with cautious curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Mr. Cook. Robert Cook." "That's right." Margaret introduced herself and explained as carefully as she could that she was researching her family's history and had found a photograph that might involve his ancestors. She showed him the photograph. Robert Cook's face went pale. He stared at the image for a long moment, then looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sadness, anger, resignation, all mixed together. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "It was hidden in my grandmother's house. I only found it a few weeks ago. Are these your grandparents?" Robert nodded slowly. "Benjamin and Mary Cook. Right there." He pointed to the couple in the photograph. "They were my grandparents. I never knew them. They died before I was born. But my father told me about them." "What did he tell you?" Margaret asked. Robert hesitated. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come inside." They sat in his small living room, surrounded by photographs of family members and a few pieces of worn furniture. Robert made tea, and then he told Margaret the story his father had told him. "My father was only 4 years old when his parents died," Robert began. "He was raised by his aunt, Mary's sister, and when he was old enough to understand, his aunt told him what happened. She said Benjamin and Mary had tried to do something brave. They had tried to get justice for something terrible that happened during the war. There were 3 people, Marcus, Joseph, and Dinah, who had been locked in a cellar as punishment. The man who owned the plantation where they were enslaved, he locked them in there and then he left, just left them there. When he came back weeks later, they were dead. My grandparents and 5 other people knew about it because they were the ones who found the bodies. Years later." Robert paused, his hands trembling slightly as he held his teacup. "They tried to tell the authorities," he continued. "They went to the sheriff. They told the truth. And you know what happened? Nothing. The inquiry was closed. The White family denied everything. And then people started dying. My grandfather drowned. My grandmother got sick and died. Other people disappeared or died in accidents. My father's aunt was convinced it wasn't accidental. She said there were people who wanted to make sure those 7 witnesses never spoke again." "Do you know who?" Margaret asked, though she already feared the answer. Robert looked at her steadily. "My father's aunt never said names, but she made it clear. It was people with power, people who had connections to the plantation owner's family, people who could make things happen without getting their own hands dirty." Margaret felt a wave of shame wash over her. Her family. Her great-grandfather had committed the crime, and her family had orchestrated the cover-up. They had silenced the witnesses. They had destroyed evidence, and they had gotten away with it. "Mr. Cook," she said, her voice shaking, "I am so sorry. I can't undo what was done. But I want you to know that I believe your grandparents. I believe they were telling the truth. And I'm going to find out everything I can about what happened." Robert gave her a sad smile. "Miss Howell, I appreciate that. But I'll tell you what my father told me. The past is the past. Those who did wrong are long gone. Justice didn't happen then, and it's not going to happen now. The only thing we can do is remember. Remember that there were people who tried. Remember that they paid a price for trying, and make sure their names aren't forgotten." Margaret left Robert Cook's house with tears in her eyes. She drove home slowly, feeling the weight of what she'd learned. By the time she reached King Street, she knew what she had to do next. She needed to find out if there were more records, more evidence of what had happened to the 7 witnesses. She needed to know exactly how they had been silenced. If you've been following this investigation as closely as I have, you're probably feeling the same mix of sadness and anger that Margaret felt. This is one of those stories that reminds us that the past isn't really past. It's always with us, shaping who we are and what we become. If you're finding this story meaningful, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future investigations like this one. These stories matter. These voices matter. And sharing them helps keep these memories alive. Margaret's investigation took a darker turn. She began looking not just at the deaths of the 7 witnesses, but at the people who had the power and motive to silence them. She started with the sheriff, James Rutherford, who had conducted the inquiry and closed it so quickly. Rutherford's records were sparse, but Margaret found something interesting in the local newspaper archives. In July of 1872, just 2 months after closing the Fairmont inquiry, Sheriff Rutherford had purchased a substantial property in downtown Charleston, a commercial building worth considerably more than his annual salary would have allowed. The purchase raised no eyebrows at the time, but Margaret saw it differently now. It looked like payment for services rendered. She also found records of donations made to Rutherford's re-election campaign in 1872. Among the donors was someone identified only as L.H., initials that matched Louisa Howell, Margaret's great-grandmother. The donation was substantial, $50, equivalent to several months' wages for a working person at that time. Margaret felt sick. Her family hadn't just defended Charles Howell's reputation, they had paid to have the inquiry buried, and possibly paid for more than that. She needed to find the letter writer, Eleanor. The letter Margaret had found with the photograph had been signed simply Eleanor, with no last name. But it contained enough clues that Margaret thought she might be able to identify her. The letter had been written with familiarity and compassion, suggesting a close friendship with Constance, and Eleanor had known details about the inquiry, suggesting she had been involved somehow. Margaret went back to the Historical Society and asked Dorothy Simmons for help. "I'm looking for a woman named Eleanor who was friends with my grandmother, Constance Howell, in the early 1870s. Constance would have been about 19 or 20 years old at the time. Eleanor seems to have been someone with knowledge of local affairs, possibly connected to the freedmen's community or to church work." Dorothy thought for a moment. During Reconstruction, there were quite a few white women who did missionary work or charity work with the freedmen's community. It was one of the few acceptable ways for educated women to be involved in public affairs. "Let me check the records of the various charitable societies that were active in the 1870s. She returned half an hour later with a ledger. "I found several organizations, but one stands out, the Ladies' Relief Association of Charleston. It was founded in 1866 to provide aid to war widows and orphans, but by the early 1870s, it had expanded its mission to include education and support for freed people. Here's a list of the members in 1872. She pointed to a name on the page. "Eleanor Wainwright." "Eleanor Wainwright," Margaret repeated. "Does it say anything about her?" Dorothy scanned the ledger. "It says she was the daughter of Judge Marcus Wainwright. She was unmarried, which was somewhat unusual for a woman of her class at that time, and it says she was particularly involved in the establishment of schools and churches for the black community." Dorothy looked up. If she was involved in church work, that might explain how she knew about the inquiry. She might have been connected to Reverend Tilden's congregation. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Is there any way to find out more about her? Letters, diaries, anything? "Judge Wainwright was a prominent figure," Dorothy said. "His family papers might be archived somewhere. Let me make some calls." 2 days later, Dorothy called Margaret with news. The Wainwright family papers were held at the College of Charleston Library in their special collections. Margaret made an appointment and went there the following afternoon. The librarian brought out 3 boxes of documents: letters, diaries, legal papers, and personal effects from the Wainwright family. Margaret spent hours sifting through them. And then, in the second box, she found what she was looking for: a diary belonging to Eleanor Wainwright, spanning the years 1870 to 1880. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. The diary was written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter she'd found with the photograph. She began reading, starting with the entries from early 1872. January 15th, 1872. Visited the Mount Pleasant congregation today. Reverend Tilden is doing admirable work with very limited resources. The people there have suffered so much, and yet they remain hopeful. One cannot help but admire their resilience. February 3rd, 1872. Constance came to tea today. She is much changed since her father's death. There is a sadness in her that she will not speak of directly, but I sense she is carrying a great burden. March 9th, 1872. Constance confided in me today, in the strictest secrecy. What she told me has left me shaken. Her father confessed something to her before his death, a terrible thing that happened during the war. 3 people died, and it was his fault. He left them locked in a cellar and forgot about them. Constance is tormented by this knowledge. She does not know whether to speak publicly or to keep her father's secret. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. So Constance had told Eleanor. She had trusted someone with the truth. The diary continued. March 22nd, 1872. Reverend Tilden came to see me today. He asked for my counsel on a delicate matter. 7 members of his congregation have come to him with a story about events that occurred at the Fairmont estate during the war. The story they tell matches exactly what Constance told me her father confessed. These 7 people witnessed the aftermath of Charles Howell's crime. They found the bodies. They want justice, but they are afraid. Reverend Tilden wants to know if I think they should come forward. I told him the truth, that justice is unlikely, but that bearing witness is important regardless of the outcome. April 11th, 1872. The 7 witnesses have gone to the sheriff. Reverend Tilden accompanied them. I have prayed for their safety and for a just outcome, though in my heart I fear neither will come to pass. April 24th, 1872. I arranged for the 7 witnesses to have their photograph taken at Mr. Waring's studio. It seemed important to create a record of their existence, of their courage. Whatever happens with the inquiry, I want there to be proof that they tried. May 4th, 1872. The inquiry has been closed. No evidence, they say, no charges. I am not surprised, but I am heartsick. I went to Constance and told her what happened. She wept. She knows the allegations are true, but she cannot bring herself to contradict her family's public denial. I understand her position, but it pains me to see justice denied so completely. May 16th, 1872. I gave Constance the photograph of the 7 witnesses. She asked for it specifically. She said she wanted to keep it as a reminder. A reminder of what? She would not say. But I think she wants to remember that there were people who knew the truth and tried to speak it, even though the world would not listen. June 20th, 1872. Terrible news. Benjamin Cook has drowned. Constance came to me in a panic. She believes it was not an accident. She believes her family is behind it, though she has no proof. I told her she must be careful, that making accusations without evidence would only endanger her. But I share her suspicions. August 12th, 1872. Mary Cook is dead. Fever, they say. Constance came to me again. She is nearly hysterical with guilt. She believes the witnesses are being killed one by one. She begged me to help her, but what can I do? I have no power, no influence beyond my small charitable work. I advised her to keep the photograph hidden, to say nothing, to protect herself. October 15th, 1872. Elias Grant is dead. An accident, they claim, but 3 witnesses dead in 6 months. Constance no longer leaves her house. She has cut off contact with most of her family. She writes to me in code, afraid that her letters might be intercepted. This tragedy has consumed both of us. Margaret read through the rest of Eleanor's diary entries from that period. The references to the Fairmont witnesses became less frequent as the years went on, but they never stopped entirely. In 1873, Eleanor wrote about Thomas Perry's death and the disappearance of Susanna Gray and Rachel Perry. In 1881, she wrote about Samuel Porter's death, noting that he had spent his last years unable to speak. The final entry related to the case was dated 1885. I saw Constance today. We have not spoken in depth about the Fairmont matter in many years, but it still haunts us both. She told me she has hidden the photograph where no one will find it. She has made a kind of memorial for those 7 people, she says, though she will never be able to tell anyone about it. We are both old women now, carrying secrets that will die with us. Perhaps that is as it should be. Or perhaps we are cowards. I no longer know. Margaret closed the diary carefully. She sat in the quiet reading room of the library, surrounded by the physical remnants of the past, and tried to process what she'd learned. Her grandmother had known. Eleanor had known. They had watched as 7 people were systematically silenced, and they had done nothing. They had kept the secret. They had hidden the photograph, and now Margaret knew too. The question was, what would she do with that knowledge? For the next month, Margaret lived in a state of constant anxiety. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't focus on her teaching. Every time she looked at the photograph, still lying on her kitchen table, exactly where she'd left it, she saw 7 faces staring back at her, demanding something she wasn't sure she could give. She tried talking to her friend, a fellow teacher named Catherine, without revealing the full story. She posed it as a hypothetical. If you discovered that your family had done something terrible a long time ago, would you make it public? Would you destroy your family's reputation to honor the truth? Catherine had thought about it for a moment, then said, I don't know. I guess it depends on whether making it public would actually do any good. If everyone involved is dead, if there's no one left to punish or to compensate, what's the point? You'd just be hurting innocent people, the descendants who had nothing to do with it. Margaret had nodded, but she wasn't satisfied with that answer, because there were descendants. There were people like Robert Cook, who carried the knowledge that their ancestors had been silenced and forgotten. Didn't they deserve to have the truth acknowledged? She decided to talk to a lawyer, not to file any kind of legal action, but just to understand what the implications might be. She went to see Martin Jennings, an elderly attorney who had handled her father's estate. She explained the situation, carefully omitting names and specific details, and asked what he thought. Martin had listened carefully, then leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Howell, I'll be frank with you. From a legal standpoint, there's nothing that can be done. The crimes you're describing, if they occurred, are far beyond any statute of limitations. The perpetrators are dead. The property has changed hands multiple times. As for the witnesses who were allegedly killed, proving that their deaths were murders rather than accidents would be impossible at this late date. Even if you had concrete evidence, which it sounds like you don't, there's no legal remedy available. But what about the historical record? Margaret had asked. What about just making sure people know what happened? Martin had given her a long, appraising look. That's not a legal question, Mrs. Howell. That's a moral one, and I can't answer that for you. I will say this, though. If you choose to go public with this information, you should be prepared for the consequences. Your family's name will be associated with a terrible crime. Your children will have to live with that, and there will be people, many people, who will say you're betraying your own family for no good reason. Margaret had left his office feeling more confused than ever. She spent days wrestling with the decision, weighing the arguments on both sides. On one hand, the truth mattered. Justice mattered. The 7 witnesses deserved to be remembered, and what had been done to them deserved to be condemned. On the other hand, making it public would hurt innocent people. Her own children, her extended family, even the Davidson family whose grandfather had helped destroy evidence. And then one evening, while Margaret was sitting in her grandmother's bedroom, staring at the space in the wall where the photograph had been hidden, she had a sudden realization. She wasn't the first person to face this dilemma. Constance had faced it too, and Eleanor had faced it. Both of them had wrestled with the same impossible choice. Speak the truth and cause harm, or keep silent and protect the innocent. They had chosen silence, but they had also chosen to preserve the evidence. They had hidden the photograph, yes, but they hadn't destroyed it. They had written letters and diary entries that documented what had happened. They had created a record that could be discovered someday by someone who might be brave enough to do what they couldn't do. They had left the choice to the future. And now, Margaret was the future. She was the person Constance and Eleanor had unconsciously been entrusting with this decision. And she realized that she didn't have to make the same choice they had made. She could choose differently, but she could also choose the same way. And if she did, it wouldn't be because she was a coward. It would be because she understood, as they had understood, that sometimes protecting the living is more important than honoring the dead. Margaret spent 3 more weeks researching, documenting and organizing everything she'd found. She created a comprehensive file, copies of the death certificates, the inquiry report, excerpts from Eleanor's diary, the photograph and her own written account of her investigation. She included Robert Cook's testimony and everything Henry Davidson had told her. It was a complete record of what had happened at Fairmont in 1865, the cover-up in 1872, and the silencing of the 7 witnesses. And then she made her decision. On a cold day in December 1954, Margaret Howell sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. It was addressed, "To whom it may concern," and it began, "My name is Margaret Howell, and I am the great-granddaughter of Charles Howell, who owned the Fairmont plantation near Charleston, South Carolina. In April of 1952, I discovered a photograph that had been hidden in the walls of my grandmother's home for at least 50 years. That photograph showed 7 people who, in 1872, came forward to report a terrible crime. This letter is my attempt to explain what I learned about that crime, about those 7 people, and about why I am making the decision I'm making." She wrote for hours, detailing everything: the discovery of the photograph, her research, the inquiry, the deaths of the witnesses, the conspiracy of silence. She wrote about Constance and Eleanor, about their moral struggle and their choice to hide the truth. And then she wrote about her own dilemma. "I have spent months trying to decide what to do with this information. If I go public, my family's name will be destroyed. My children will grow up under the shadow of what their great-great-grandfather did. People will judge us for crimes we didn't commit. And for what purpose? Everyone directly involved is dead. There is no justice to be served, only pain to be inflicted on the living. But if I stay silent, I am complicit in the cover-up. I am allowing the memory of 7 courageous people to be erased. I am saying that protecting my family's reputation is more important than honoring the truth. I cannot make that choice lightly. And so I have decided on a middle path." Margaret explained her plan in the letter. She would not go public immediately. She would not release the information to newspapers or historians. Instead, she would seal everything: the photograph, the documents, the letter, in a package that would not be opened until after her death. She would deposit that package in a bank vault with explicit instructions that it should be turned over to the Charleston Historical Society after she passed away. At that point, historians and descendants could decide what to do with the information. But by then, enough time would have passed that the immediate harm to her children would be minimized. "I know this is a compromise," she wrote. "I know it means I am not being as brave as I could be. But I have come to understand something that my grandmother understood, that there are no perfect choices in situations like this. There are only choices that minimize harm while preserving the possibility of truth. I want the truth to be known eventually. I want Benjamin Cook, Mary Cook, Elias Grant, Susanna Gray, Thomas Perry, Rachel Perry, and Samuel Porter to be remembered. I want people to know that they tried to speak out, that they paid a terrible price for their courage, and that the system failed them. But I also want to protect my children from bearing the burden of sins they did not commit. So I am leaving this decision to the future. Someday when I am gone and my children are grown and strong enough to weather whatever storms may come, this package will be opened, and whoever opens it will have the information they need to decide what should be done. I can only hope that I am making the right choice. I can only pray that those 7 people, wherever they are, will understand why I am not speaking out immediately. And I can only trust that the truth, even if it takes decades to emerge, will eventually be told. Margaret Howell, December 12, 1954. She sealed the letter along with the photograph and all her documentation in a metal box. She took it to the Charleston Bank and Trust and arranged for it to be placed in a safety deposit box with strict instructions. The box was not to be opened until after her death, at which point the contents should be delivered to the Charleston Historical Society. Then Margaret went home and she tried to move on with her life, but moving on was easier said than done. Margaret found that she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, about the 7 faces, about the choice she'd made. She threw herself into her teaching, into raising her 2 children, into the ordinary routines of life. But at night, when the house was quiet, she would lie awake and wonder if she'd done the right thing. She went back to visit Robert Cook. She told him carefully that she had documented everything, and that someday after she was gone, the truth would be made public. Robert had listened quietly, then nodded. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Howell," he'd said. "It's more than most people would do. And I'll tell you something, I don't blame you for not going public now. You've got children to think about. My grandparents had children too. That's why they were so careful about what they said, even when they knew they were in danger. We all do what we can to protect our families. That's just human nature." His words had given Margaret some comfort, but not enough to completely ease her guilt. The years passed. Margaret continued teaching. Her children grew up, went to college, started their own lives. She remarried in 1960, a kind man named Thomas Brennan, who knew nothing about her family's dark history and to whom she never told the story. She thought about telling him many times, but she could never find the right words. How do you explain to someone that your great-grandfather was responsible for the deaths of 3 people and that your family orchestrated the murder of 7 witnesses? How do you carry that kind of knowledge into a new marriage? So she kept it to herself. It became a lonely burden, one she carried alone for more than 3 decades. In the 1980s, Margaret began to develop health problems. Heart disease ran in her family, and by 1987, she knew her time was limited. She thought about the safety deposit box, about the package that would be opened after her death. She thought about the photograph and the 7 faces, and she wondered what would happen when the truth finally came out. She made one final addition to the package. She wrote another letter, dated March 1989, just a few months before she died. In it, she reflected on her choice and whether she still believed it had been the right one. "I'm an old woman now, facing the end of my life," she wrote, "and I still don't know if I made the right decision. I protected my children, yes. They grew up without the stigma of their great-great-grandfather's crimes, but I also allowed a terrible injustice to remain hidden for decades longer than it needed to be. I wonder sometimes if Benjamin Cook, Mary Cook, Elias Grant, Susanna Gray, Thomas Perry, Rachel Perry, and Samuel Porter can forgive me for my cowardice. Because that's what it was in the end. Cowardice dressed up as prudence. But I also hope that whoever reads this will understand that I did preserve the truth. I did make sure it would be told eventually. And I did try, in my own limited way, to honor those 7 people who showed courage when I could not. If you are reading this, you now have a choice to make. You can decide whether this story should be made public, whether these names should be remembered, whether this chapter of history deserves to be told. I leave that decision in your hands. I only ask that you consider carefully, as I did, the cost of truth and the value of memory. Margaret Howell Brennan, March 15, 1989. Margaret died on July 22, 1989. She was 78 years old. Her funeral was well attended. Former students, fellow teachers, family members, friends. The obituary in the Charleston newspaper described her as a dedicated educator and a beloved member of the community. There was no mention of Fairmont, no mention of a hidden photograph, no mention of 7 witnesses. 3 months after Margaret's death, her executor followed the instructions in her will and contacted the Charleston Bank and Trust about the safety deposit box. The bank, in turn, contacted the Charleston Historical Society, as Margaret had requested. The package was delivered to the society in October 1989. The director of the Historical Society at that time was a historian named Dr. Patricia Williams, a black woman who had spent her career studying the Reconstruction era and its aftermath. When she opened Margaret's package and began reading the letters and examining the documents, she realized immediately that this was something significant. Dr. Williams spent 6 months verifying Margaret's research. She tracked down additional records, interviewed descendants of both the Howell family and the 7 witnesses, and consulted with legal experts and ethicists about how to handle such sensitive information. And in April 1990, exactly 118 years after the original inquiry, she held a press conference to announce her findings. The story made national news. It was covered by newspapers, television stations, and radio programs across the country. The photograph of the 7 witnesses was reproduced in dozens of publications. People debated Margaret's choice. Some praised her for eventually revealing the truth. Others criticized her for waiting so long. Descendants of the Howell family were horrified and angry. Some denied the allegations entirely. Others issued carefully worded statements expressing regret for any suffering that may have occurred in the past. But the most important response came from the descendants of the 7 witnesses. Dr. Williams managed to locate family members of all 7, including Robert Cook's son, Margaret Perry's great-grandson, and distant relatives of Elias Grant and Susanna Gray. She invited them to Charleston for a memorial service to honor their ancestors. The service was held on May 3, 1991, 119 years to the day after the original inquiry had been closed. It took place at the site of the old Mount Pleasant African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had been rebuilt in the 1920s and was still an active congregation. More than 300 people attended. There were speeches, prayers, songs, and testimonies. The names of the 7 witnesses were read aloud, along with the names of Marcus, Joseph, and Dinah, the 3 people who had died in the cellar at Fairmont. Dr. Williams presented each family with a framed copy of the photograph. She also announced that the Historical Society was establishing a permanent exhibit about the Fairmont case, which would include the photograph, Margaret's letters, excerpts from Eleanor's diary, and documentation of the inquiry and its aftermath. The exhibit would be called Voices of Conscience, 7 Witnesses and the Cost of Truth. And then came the most controversial part of the memorial service. Dr. Williams announced that a historical marker would be erected at the site of the old Fairmont plantation. The marker would not mention Charles Howell by name, but it would acknowledge what had happened there and honor those who had tried to bring the truth to light. The marker was installed in June 1991 on land that was now part of a county park. It was made of granite, about 4 feet tall, with a bronze plaque. The inscription read, "In memory of Marcus, Joseph, and Dinah, who died here in January-February 1865. In memory of Benjamin Cook, Mary Cook, Elias Grant, Susanna Gray, Thomas Perry, Rachel Perry, and Samuel Porter, who bore witness and paid the price for their courage. May their voices finally be heard." The marker sparked protests from some members of Charleston's old families, who felt it was unjust to memorialize unproven allegations. There were letters to the editor, angry phone calls to the Historical Society, and even a lawsuit attempting to have the marker removed. But the lawsuit failed, and eventually the controversy died down. Today the marker still stands. School groups visit it as part of local history tours. Researchers consult the Historical Society's exhibit when studying Reconstruction and its aftermath. And every year on May 3rd, descendants of the 7 witnesses gather at the site for a memorial service. The photograph itself is now held in the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture at the College of Charleston. It's been carefully preserved and digitized. Visitors can view it online or request to see the original in person. And if you look at the faces of those 7 people, at their solemn expressions, their Sunday clothes, their dignified poses, you can see something that transcends the limitations of the old photographic technology. You can see courage. You can see determination. You can see people who knew they were taking a terrible risk and who chose to do it anyway. Margaret Howell's story raises questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. Was she right to hide the truth for so long? Should she have gone public immediately, regardless of the cost to her family? Or was her compromise, preserving the evidence while delaying its release, a reasonable middle ground? There are no easy answers. What we do know is that Margaret ensured that the truth survived. Without her decision to investigate, to document, and to preserve, the story of the 7 witnesses might have been lost forever. The photograph might have remained hidden in that wall, eventually destroyed when the house was demolished or renovated. Constance's secret would have died with her, and the names of Benjamin Cook, Mary Cook, Elias Grant, Susanna Gray, Thomas Perry, Rachel Perry, and Samuel Porter would have been forgotten. Instead, they are remembered. Their courage is honored. Their story is told, and perhaps that's what matters most. Not the timing of the revelation, not the calculations about harm and benefit, but the simple fact that the truth was preserved and eventually told. That 7 people who tried to speak out in 1872 finally had their voices heard in 1990, more than a century later. Before we finish, I want to ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, what would you have done? Would you have gone public immediately, or would you have made the same choice she did? Would you have stayed silent entirely, or found some other solution? Leave a comment below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts on this moral dilemma. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss future stories like this one. These histories matter, and sharing them helps ensure that voices from the past aren't forgotten. Thank you for listening. Margaret Howell died carrying a heavy burden, but she also died knowing that she had, in her own imperfect way, done what she could to honor the truth. The photograph, hidden for 80 years, did reveal something that changed a family's history. Not just the Howell family, but the families of 7 witnesses whose courage deserve to be remembered. In the end, the past can never truly be buried. Truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades, even after generations. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure that truth survives long enough to be heard. The 7 witnesses tried to speak in 1872. They were silenced, but their story survived. And now, finally, they have been heard.